The chapters you're reading in the Eileen Gambrill text this week, I think, are really very critical to understanding many different concepts in this course. And it is this book and these chapters in particular that I believe help to make this particular course on working with individuals something much more than working with individuals in a therapy setting. Now, as I've said before, the uh, workbook and the Hepworth text both to me have a something of a clinical leaning, most particularly Hepworth, but both of them, share ideas that can be generalized to just about any work really that you do in the social work field with individual clients. And so I don't mean to minimize the value of that information outside of the therapy setting, so to speak. But Gambrill takes us into areas of philosophy about our work that I think are really very important for us to consider and to understand as we go about our work, not only with individuals, but with groups and families and in macro settings as well. These two chapters in particular, I think, go together very well, and I have combined them both for the sake of well, parsimony, I suppose is the word, just to not overdo the number of things you're listening to this week, but also because I think these two chapters really go together very well. And one of them is really an exploration of what is knowledge, what do we understand about knowledge, and how do we determine what is good knowledge, let's say, and what isn't, and then critical thinking, which really is a bedrock concept for social work these days. So hopefully this talk will be useful to you as we work through the concepts in these two chapters. So the big question, of course, what is knowledge? And as Gambrill points out, the most important decisions that we make in our career concern how we go about evaluating the accuracy of different theories that we read about or that we search out, and their claims of effectiveness. And there are a lot of different ways that studies and theories frame their claims of effectiveness, and some of them are listed here, like for instance whether or not something is even a problem to begin with, what the risks of an intervention are. Sometimes are claimed to be high or low depending upon whether someone is trying to sell a study to you or not. What the prevalence of the problems that we're studying are in the larger population, what the causes of those problems might be, what's the best way to measure them, what the whole concept of prognosis, how accurate are predictions that if you use this technique or if you do nothing, what is likely to occur. These are all claims that really, are they tested or not? And that's sort of the thing that we have to ask ourselves as we read these claims and think about them. What evidence is there that these claims actually have some support in reality? Now we go about the notion of evaluating knowledge, and there's a list in, I believe this is in chapter 4 in her text, about different criteria that are used sometimes for evaluating claims of knowledge that are questionable in Gambrill's world, and I think these are worth looking at. And of course, the top of her list is authority. The notion that if Galic says it's so, then it has to be true. Now, as much as I hope you think that, Gambrill's going to tell you that's a no-no, and you shouldn't trust it just because I say it's the case. And this is true for much greater thinkers than me, like theories by Freud and by Hepworth, and some of the great thinkers of our time all have theories about human behavior. And while we oftentimes defer to those authorities and cite them as a reason why we believe something, it's really not a good reason to do that when you're testing knowledge. Popularity is another big one. 80% of social workers use this particular technique for this particular kind of problem, so therefore you should use it too. I have mentioned, in fact, probably in this course and in other courses that depression, the cognitive behavioral techniques are one of the things that are considered to be effective in treating depression, and perhaps the most effective things in treating depression. And there are studies that support that, but I'm willing to bet you that if we really dug deep into that question, we'd find that there are studies that don't support it as well. So because most people accept that in the field doesn't necessarily mean this is something that we should take to heart. Now, sometimes we have to shortcut our thinking processes, but we have to recognize we're shortcutting them and let our clients know that we're not really studying the the veracity of the claims, let's say, as thoroughly as we might. What's been used for many years, or better yet, this new innovative approach. How many times have I seen individuals go off to training and come back, just born again with a belief in the particular intervention that they were trained in, they begin to see everything about their clients in different light. It's kind of a new concept, and right there it's right there in the front of our brain too, because it's new to us. We maybe just learned it, and so it's something that's probably more readily accessible than some of the other theories we might have. You have to be careful about presentations where the presenter is particularly convincing and jovial, and maybe has a lot of good laughs and stories in their presentation, because sometimes those presentations really are disguising some of the less than certain principles and concepts in the technique that they're proposing. And you see a lot of other things. I don't really need to read through this list for you. One of them, that is probably worth paying attention to, the ad hominem appeals or attacks. Where because so and so is involved with this, it's no good or it is good. Instead of focusing upon what the technique is or what the knowledge is that we're looking at, instead we focus upon the individual who's presenting that knowledge, and either attacking the whole concept because of that individual, really attacking the person, and therefore eliminating the knowledge, that particular piece of information, or praising that person and accepting it without really review of the information itself. That's called an ad hominem attack or appeal. Case examples are another things. I've used this with my client and it worked, and so I really recommend that you use this. We tend to rely upon these kinds of things in the social work field a lot, again, because that's reality for us. And you'll find yourself using this kind of reasoning and talking with other people, and you'll be hearing this from other people as well. And you hear it from me, I'm pretty sure. So, again, it doesn't mean that the information that you get, that the case examples that are used aren't valid and aren't worth considering, but that doesn't in and of itself make the particular knowledge that is being shared valid and really useful. So, and intuition, which is a big one in social work, in social workers as well. I just know inside that this is going to work, or my gut told me I should do this. Again, I've been told by my instructors during my training that I had a strong sense of intuition and I should follow it in my interviews, and it seems to have worked very well for me throughout my career. But again, in terms of evaluating knowledge and in terms of choosing a particular approach, not a particularly scientific one to use. So what is science and what is not science? Science is described in Gambrill as a way of thinking about and investigating the accuracy of assumptions about the world. It's a process for solving problems in which we learn from our mistakes. We learn from our mistakes. That's a very important concept in scientific knowledge. One of the things it does is it rejects reliance on authority. Science doesn't matter who said this or whatever. We're going to test this out, and if it tests out that this is not true, then that authority is no longer valid. It doesn't just stop because authority says. It emphasizes the elimination of errors by means of criticism. Scientists are not, good scientists at least, are not, not overreactive to criticism of their studies and of their findings, because they know that other people are going to come behind them and test out those conclusions. So as Gambrill says, by testing our guesses, we eliminate false theories and learn more about the problem. Scientific statements can be tested and therefore can be refuted. So this goes back to that notion that we talked about earlier about sociology and tentative truth, that we can never accurately claim that a theory is the truth and is the final truth, because some study may come along later on, some scientist may come along later on that disproves our theory that might have been held as gospel for many, many decades. So what we can never really know what the truth is. We can only eliminate false beliefs. The experimental testing is more severe tests of claims than any anecdotal report. Um, Uncertainty is always assumed in science. So as I said, future tests may show that whatever assumption we have at the present time is incorrect. Explanations are usually parsimonious. There's not a lot of extraneous kinds of information in scientific studies. It really kind of gets down to the heart of the matter. And if you find a lot of fluff in a report of a scientific study that really isn't about the study or the problem, it may be an indication that there's some uncertainty there that's not being reported honestly. Rational, critical, aimed at eliminating errors, and looks for criticism of its reviews. I like this line. It is the belief in the ignorance of experts. Some things that science is not. Pseudoscience makes scientific claims but presents no evidence to support them. Weak evidence is accepted just as readily as any strong evidence might be. It relies on anecdotes a lot. It isn't self-correcting, and it is not skeptical, which scientific studies are skeptical. If it equates an open mind with an uncritical one. In other words, open mind for most of us mean that we're willing to consider alternative points of view, and we're willing to look for refutations, I guess is the word, of things that have been proven in the past. That's an open mind. But in pseudoscience, an open mind is out to kind of take whatever, I'll accept any assertion. So open mind is confused in pseudoscience with not really questioning things. If data is falsified, it's ignored or explained away. There's a lot more vague language in pseudoscience. It is not empirical. It comes up with beliefs and faith, but doesn't really produce knowledge, and it's not testable. So, and it doesn't depend on repeatability like a good scientific study will be, where we increase the certainty of a certain thing by continuing repeating the study of that thing and seeing that the results are replicated. Not in pseudoscience. Anti-science, the rejection of the validity of scientific methods. And I think it's something that it's a couple things in this talk. In fact, I think that we're all too familiar with these days in the political arena. And when Gambrill wrote her book, I don't think anybody really conceived that, world leaders would be anti-scientists in this day and age. But in any event, aside from the politics involved in anti-science, it is very common in popular culture, and it's actually, she says, more prevalent in academic settings than we would want to admit. I don't have any examples of that. I suppose if I tell you, just listen to me, and I know what I'm talking about, that maybe that's anti-science. But I hope there's not a lot of that going on in academia, but perhaps there is. And anti-science comes from the confusion of science and pseudoscience. People aren't able to distinguish between them, and a good example of that, I think, is the rejection of the concept of climate change and all the counterclaims that come in there. And oftentimes the counterclaims really are poorly supported, whereas most of the claims about climate change and global warming are things that are have solid studies behind them and a lot of evidence to support them. And so the general public won't sort through what is good science and what is not good science so much when they read about it in USA Today or they see it on Fox News. or hear it on NPR. Let's be fair and balanced here. There's other claims that are worth watching out for include quackery, which is the promotion and marketing of untested, worthless, and sometimes dangerous products and procedures for profit, oftentimes by professionals as well as other people. And the people who are subject to this, as you see a lot of times, they're desperate. They lack suspicion. Perhaps they're not very sophisticated thinkers, and they don't trust professionals. Maybe believe in magic, and just place too much confidence that something works. And not being a I'm happy to say, not having had to face this, I remember some years ago there was a treatment that was pretty popular for cancer called Laetrile, and it wasn't approved by the FDA, but people were convinced that it was effective, and a lot of cancer patients were abandoning the tested treatments for cancer, which of course aren't producing the kind of results even still that we want to see, but would abandon those things that are tested and proven scientifically to go to Mexico where it was legal, and go to clinics down there to get the Laetrile treatments. And I haven't followed up in the long run. It's been a long time since I've heard that, but this is an example, I think, of maybe an example at least of quackery. I suspect that in the long run it was discovered that it really wasn't effective at all, and if it were, I think we would have had this approved here a long time ago. So perhaps an example of that, people were very desperate for a cure, and will go to anything that might increase, they think, increase their chances in their own minds. Propaganda, which is a deliberate attempt to shape behavior and attitude, counting on people really not thinking about what's being said, and particularly in the election season that has passed and those that are to come. A lot of propaganda on your TV screens and in the news for that matter. So propaganda wants to squelch this dissent through oversimplification. I mean, dissenting thoughts with oversimplification, generalizations that really are inaccurate, appearing to the emotions, or creating and exacerbating a fear that something terrible is going to happen if you don't do what I tell you to do. Those kinds of things. Contradictory evidence is censored, and again, is something that I think we're a little too familiar with in the news these days. And puffery, I like that word. It's the inflation of knowledge claims uh, that I'm sorry, the inflation of knowledge claims is one strategy used in propaganda. This inflation of knowledge claims is puffery. I don't even understand my own writing here. So critical thinking is I guess one way to evaluate knowledge. It is the way to evaluate knowledge, and is something that I think is very critical to our ability in the profession to do our job effectively and properly. Critical thinking is described as a unique kind of purposeful thinking in which we use standards such as clarity and fairness to evaluate evidence related to claims about what is true and what is not. It involves a careful examination of claims and arguments to arrive at well-reasoned ones. So when you look at this kind of list here, what are the characteristics of critical thinking as opposed to thinking that is kind of more, just more, uncritical. It's more clear, it's more accurate. It really looks for accuracy, whereas the others aren't always as focused upon accuracy. It's relevant. Does it connect to your client? Basically, is this something that really matters to your client? It looks for consistency. It's logical in its process. It tends to look at things deeply rather than narrowly. It doesn't accept the superficial summaries of a finding, but will look into what the control group was, what the sample group was, how large is the sample, how good were the questions, those kinds of things, so that it really will study things much more deeply. It tends to be more complete. It looks for significant issues, not trivial things, and it's more fair. It's not biased. It really looks at both sides of things, and critical thinking. When you're looking at theories, for instance, one of the ways you can really tell a study is a good study. They tell us is that they mention the well argued alternative views. Those kinds of things that people the disagreements with the outcome of particular studies are mentioned in the study, or in the summary at least, that kind of says, well, there are other people who think differently and this is what they're saying. And if those have been well tested and well argued, that's a good sign of a really good study. We use it in evidence-based practice because it's purposeful and it's guided by intellectual standards, supports traits such as intellectual humility and integrity. Just we don't always know what we think we know, and so we take the time to study and look for advances and changes and disputations of the things that we believe. I think that's what we mean here by intellectual humility. It's self-critical and self-corrective, characterized by integrity of thought, and comes up with a well-reasoned answer. The interesting one of the key elements of critical thinking also is that it recognizes the need to argue from opposing point of views. So again, it's not a defensive kind of a presentation of a belief, but rather it is willing to look at the alternatives to the belief, and to consider the other viewpoints that are involved. And this is again something that I think is preciously absent in the social discourse in our world today. And the text points out that critical thinking has a lot of elements and qualities in common with scientific reasoning and evidence-based practice. And so this is one of the reasons why this all comes together in one talk. When you think a little bit about critical thinking, here's an example. Gambrill uses and this is one of the things that comes up repeatedly in her text, the concept of self-esteem, and if we emphasize improving self-esteem, and this is this may seem like sort of a superficial kind of an example, because we don't typically treat people just for self-esteem problems, but we often describe their problems as arising from poor self-esteem, let's say. And this emphasis upon self-esteem as the cause of problems, she says we should ask ourselves, who benefits from that emphasis and who loses from that benefit from that emphasis. And she points to macro issues, as she does often in this text. It's one of the reasons I like this text, is that she talks about the fact that we often blame things or pin things on the individual, when in fact there are so many things in the environment that create the problems. It isn't the individual's fault. It has to do with the individual adapting to and living with the issues in the environment. So she says, governments, state, local, federal, save millions of dollars by attributing poor academic and job performance to students' low self-esteem, which comes from a family system that, maybe the father is absent, and, the mother isn't working or something like that, or she's a welfare recipient, all those kinds of things, blaming the individuals in the family unit, but really don't provide adequate funding for education, for good housing, safe neighborhoods, for employment, for health care, so that people can stay healthy and stay involved in their education and in their work, recreation, to provide successful experiences. All these kinds of things are the things that self-esteem is established through. And rather than focusing upon the individual, she says, maybe we ought to be looking at these larger issues and attacking them on a more macro level. And it's to the government's, the taxpayers' benefit, I suppose, that we allow ourselves to focus on the individual in our interventions too often. So if we identify the personal and social causes to our problems, then we're in a better position to offer our clients real influence over the quality of their lives. Not only might we be able to affect some change or call attention to the need for change, but in informing the client, it could activate the client to begin to do things to address those larger issues in his or her life as well. And she said this really shows us the connection between private troubles and social issues. In my introductory courses, I find myself apologizing to the students sometimes because of the fact that my political leanings become fairly quickly evident, and I suppose I suppose that wouldn't be a surprise, but in those intro courses, a lot of times we get a lot of conservative people that are taking this class for different reasons, and from time to time, I've seen comments in my course evaluations to suggest that I should give equal time to conservative viewpoints, and I do, because I tell students and encourage students to speak up and voice their opinions, and I think I'm pretty clear that they don't have to agree with me to get a good grade. I mean, but I also point out to them that politics is, you can't separate out an issue about working with people and working in the social work field and keep politics out of it, because the social issues that impact our clients are all connected to political discussions and discourse and political actions taken. And so, private troubles and social issues are connected very deeply, and we need to keep that in mind. But again, Gambrill goes back to, I've never heard of this. I think his name was Stuart Margolin. Under the Cover of Kindness, The Invention of Social Work is the name of is the title of the book that he wrote in '97. He said that knowledge about clients, that we use knowledge about our clients to attain power over their lives, and he suggests that social work's rejection of political motives encourages a sort of immunity to criticism from clients. In other words, we in allowing ourselves to focus upon, we may be not blaming the victim, so to speak, but allowing ourselves to focus upon changing the victim in a sick society, in a unjust society where inequalities and oppression overwhelm our lives. By buying into this concept that we will help individuals change to function better in society, we're really denying all of the political stuff that has to do with what's impacting them, and therefore, if they don't get better, it's because it's them. They're the ones that are failing here. So think about, as an example of critical thinking, and again, I'm going to refer back to one of my introductory courses here. I'm using an excellent book in my intro to social welfare that I like, and so one of the things, of course, this is since it's about social welfare, the topic is women on welfare, and the question is, what assumptions do we hold about women and welfare? Think about this for a second and ask yourself. Now, as a trained social worker, your attitudes about women on welfare, and your beliefs about their attitudes, which is the second question here, are probably much better refined. And maybe you came to this field with those attitudes refined. That's one of the reasons you're in the social work field, of course. But if you didn't come to them understanding that, I suspect that as you've gone through social work training, you have come to an understanding it's different from what you entered it with about this topic. And but understand, most of the population of the United States have not. And again, many of the students in my intro course haven't reached that point. They're just starting to open this door. Most of them hadn't even thought about this. They just accept what they've been told over the years. And the kinds of things that we hear as we talk about women on welfare, or as we grow up listening to our parents and our aunts and uncles talk about it, or watch the news, why do they make such poor choices with their money? They spend their money gambling and those kinds of things. I stood in line behind a woman who used food stamps to buy steaks. As I think I've told you before, I don't understand why people are looking in other people's shopping baskets, but that's a whole other story. They only want to watch their flat screen television. They don't want to work. And the flat screen TV, That's a big issue with them. How can they spend all that money on such a limited check when their kids aren't they're just not adequate able to support their kids on their own. And why do they keep having more and more children? I heard a woman one time say something on television addressing this problem, and looked at the TV screen and talking to welfare mothers saying, "We want you to stop having babies. That's what we want." So that's sort of the popular attitudes out there about women on welfare. And this is a great example. This is one of the ways that I introduce critical thinking in my intro courses is that it really calls upon us to consider the questions such as this on a much deeper level, less superficial, and to search for the context behind such decisions. And this is just a paragraph from the first chapter of one of the books I read. It's called "So You Think I Drive a Cadillac," and it's written by Karen Seacom. And she says, I'm going to read this to you, so bear with me. As I explore women's experience with welfare, I capture the shared meaning of motherhood within our society. The book illustrates that poor women share many of the same struggles and concerns about their children's lives that others who are more affluent do. They are passionately concerned about being good mothers, a job that is considered the most important job of all. They strive to promote the well-being of their children in multiple ways. They fear for the safety of their neighborhoods. They want to get out of the housing projects, which they say are crime-ridden and filled with despair. They dream of their own house with a picket fence around it. They search for jobs, particularly ones that will pay them enough money to let them provide basic necessities for their families, such as food, adequate shelter, health insurance, and clothing. Offering their children some semblance of a middle class lifestyle, such as name brand athletic shoes or cable television, is considered paramount for their children's self esteem. These are shared goals, thus, affluent women have more in common with poor women than they probably realize and may care to know. Without making heroes of the women interviewed, I show that the distinctions between us and them are largely arbitrary and are artifacts of having or not having enough money to cushion the blows dealt by life. I think that's a very powerful description of what she does in this particular book, and it takes some chapters for most readers to really start catching on to that. That to stop blaming the victims of poverty in this situation and begin to understand how some of the decisions that welfare mothers make are really responsible parental decisions. For instance, staying on welfare when they have an opportunity to take a low-paying job that doesn't offer health insurance benefits. Now, one of the ways that the system tries to encourage, at least they did, I believe this is still the case, to encourage women off of public assistance, off of TANF programs, is to extend Medicaid for a year after the check stops. I don't know if that's continuing or not, but it had been for many years at least. And the idea being that they still have that health insurance, and that during the course of that year, they get a job where they could have health insurance for their family and their kids. And of course, you and I both know that that doesn't really happen so easily, particularly for this marginally employed population where they're likely to start out at the very bottom of the barrel, and most of them will, and aren't likely to get a full-time job. And if they get a full-time job, it's probably not going to be a job that gives them good benefits. It's just the way the economy is these days. And so it's a responsible decision by a mother of three to not seek employment under those circumstances, because her children would lose their health coverage if she did. So there's that kind of thinking, I think. Same thing with the flat screen TV and the name brand sneakers and or athletic shoes or whatever we want to call them these days. Is that it gives their kids some sense of pride. The TV keeps them inside more than being outside. Maybe a game platform of some sort, like an Xbox or something, keeps the kid in the living room and out of the gang down the street, maybe those kinds of things. And so we have to think more deeply about problems such as this, and that's what I call critical thinking. We can understand things so much better if we look beneath the surface and we don't respond to the superficial things, and instead we look at the things on a much deeper level. And that's why it says it's deep and not superficial. It's an antidote to propaganda and allows a kind of a self-emancipation through new knowledge. You kind of disconnect yourself from what the authorities insist and what others tell you and what you're hearing around you, and it allows you to look for your own truths basically. And when we use critical thinking in our practice, evidence-based or otherwise. One of the biggest benefits is that it considers context, like I was just describing. That's context there, and we tend to blame people for their situation. And we tend to feel a need to change people less if we understand their situation, the context of their lives, and how all of that contributes to the issues that we're addressing. Discourages the promotion of ignorance. That's another great line. I love this. And there's a number of different advantages here to the use of critical thinking, evidence-based practices that kind of grow out of the kinds of things we've already talked about. Some more examples. Um, Incomplete analysis or oversimplification when we oversimplify client concerns. Here's an example of a headline. She mentions the text, crack addicted mother kills baby. And just with the headline itself, and this is what the public is consuming. The blame is placed on the mother, and doesn't point to the poverty that she lives in, or probably the abandonment she's experienced in her lives, both past and present. All those other factors that contribute to her addiction to begin with. It just focuses upon the fact that she took an action that was reprehensible and doesn't address why, which is where the solution to these problems are. Another, she mentions a study about bullies. It says the bullies beat up others because of low self-esteem. There was some report about that by some supposed expert. She says, and the fact is that most research shows that bullies have very, very robust self-esteem, as she calls it. They think very highly of themselves, and self-esteem is not the issue. But again, this is what we tend to believe, and there are some experts who kind of through whatever means, they go about convincing us that and really leading us in the wrong direction. So critical thinking, gives us an opportunity to really test out claims like this and not be misled by false claims. As Gambrill points out in the text, Fox News is watched by millions, and I'll just leave that there. How do we know what evidence to use? Client-oriented criteria for selecting material include such things as relevance. Is it useful to achieving the client's goals? You don't want to use a procedure or a theory, let's say, about if it's not going to connect with what the issue is to begin with and what the client wants. Evidentiary status. Has it been tested and found to be effective in achieving these particular goals? Can it be used here? That's feasibility. I mean, do you have the resources you need, including time, to carry something out? It's a part of your resources. And range. Which clients and situations can it be applied to? Are the subjects of the studies, let's say, that you're looking at or whatever, do they have anything to do at all with the groups that your client belongs to? Or is your client not connected at all to these people? So a study of a certain group of people that have no connection to your client is really doesn't give you any useful information about whether or not an approach, an intervention, a technique, a theory, whatever it is, will be helpful for your client. There are some obstacles to the use of critical thinking that are within us. The essence of self-deception is not being aware that you deceive yourself. It's a good line to remember. If we have a willingness to suspend disbelief and rush from task to task, again, that's not going to help us in terms of making use of critical thinking. If we have disdain for intellectual rigor, because you have to actually do something to really use critical thinking effectively. You have to do some studies, and reading and learning requires action. she says. Misconceptions about ourselves, where our values come from. We think a lot of, we believe certain things, and we think that is, our own value or belief without really looking at the fact that a lot of these things were given to us. I see this in my intro courses. I may have told you already, in my intro students, my young students in particular, who pretty much, when they talk about social issues, are oftentimes just kind of spewing back what they've been told by their parents or the influential others in their lives about certain issues, and they haven't really given it their own thought and their own look. And that's one of my tasks in those courses, is to get people thinking for themselves and looking at these issues on their own. Likewise, another book I use in my intro to social welfare class, written by Phyllis Day, you may be familiar with it. She talks about 9 values in America that, as an American, it's a part of our fabric. We have it inside of us somewhere, even though intellectually we may not believe them superficially. Oftentimes, when we're responding from our gut, we're reacting from that. Individualism is one of those values. Where everybody should take care of themselves. No, as social workers, we don't necessarily agree with that. But if you really listen to yourself, the quietness of your soul at night, you may find yourself subscribing to some of that, blaming people sometimes because they're not standing on their own 2 feet or taking care of things on their own. That is not because you believe it intellectually, or because you accept it intellectually. It's something inside of you. White patriarch, or white privilege, patriarchy, and I'll guarantee you, patriarchy, no matter whether you're male or female, no matter how much your consciousness has been raised about gender issues and gender roles and role expectations and those kinds of things, we all have aspects of patriarchy in our thinking sometimes. Even if it's in our jokes, these things come out, and we know better than to subscribe to them. We would advocate against them, but understand there are kernels of those things inside of all of us as Americans, and that's what Day is telling us, and why it is that our social welfare system is set up the way it is, to really to punish the recipients and to limit them rather than to help them. And this is, I think, what Gambrill's talking about here. Understanding we have misconceptions about ourselves. We have misconceptions about the truth. That the notion that people create their own truth, and a confusion about our values. The idea that moral relativism, which many people believe in. That well, it doesn't apply in this culture, but if you're in that culture, it makes sense. But acceptance of moral relativism, she says, makes it really impossible to judge an action or a behavior or something like that. Basing our beliefs on our feelings, all of these things. Ruggiero says, actually, the preceding 5 elements were from his contribution to this chapter. All these things lead to an intellectual insecurity that is also a obstacle to the use of critical thinking. So there's a lot of things inside of us that maybe prevent us from wanting to make use of it. Of course, if we don't have enough time to carefully plan services, then we know. I mean, and Gambrill points this out, that a lot of times we have to triage our problems and try to figure out. We have limited resources. Who's going to most benefit from the use of this resource? And sometimes, sadly, true, not apply resources to everybody that can use it, because we only have so much to go around, and you have to figure out where best to put your resources, and again, that includes your time. But she also reminds us that just because we don't think about this, because we say, well, I can't do anything about it, so I'm not going to think about it, that in not thinking about it, we we really keep ourselves from doing anything to take corrective steps. And so she says, well, first of all, she says maybe with as you get more skilled, you're going to be able to help your clients resolve some of their problems more quickly, so that will give you more time, or that you may be able to come to some recognition of a problem that can be solved more quickly. Remember also one of the ideas about doing of the three pass review of any study that we talked about earlier. One of the things you're supposed to do with that at the end is to keep a log of what you've learned. And the idea of this is that you may be able to shortcut some of the studies necessary in evidence-based practice, because you've got this log and you can refer back to it, and it may help you save some time too in selecting interventions that might be effective. Although again, remember that knowledge is always evolving, and so you can't necessarily rest on that log from 10 years ago, because there's probably new studies that may dispute whatever it is that your old study came up with. And maybe you'll be able to find colleagues that you can work with who will advocate with you for a change in policy or practices that limit these service options. That's another thing. It doesn't necessarily make you popular with it oftentimes will not. Let me rephrase this. Oftentimes it will make you unpopular with your leaders and with your agency administrators. But if you're working for a good agency, they understand what social workers do, and part of that is advocacy for on behalf of clients. A lot of helpful questions to make use of, and in critical thinking in your practice. Is it true? Is there evidence against it? Are there well argued alternative views? What are my assumptions, and has this been critically tested, and how can I test my own assumptions and my own predictions? What is the sample size? That kind of thing. So there, again, a lot of questions there that you can make use of in evaluating different claims, different studies, different approaches and interventions. And a few things that are helpful in kind of understanding the concept of evidence-based practice, and one of them is truth and credibility. The phrase we hear frequently is, this was very credible, he was credible, she was credible. What credible is believable, and that is not necessarily true. Reasoning and truth are two different things. Reasoning doesn't necessarily lead us to the truth. Something being widely accepted is different from being well supported. What is widely accepted is not necessarily accurate. And in fact, what's well supported may not be accurate either, but it's probably closer to being accurate. A feeling in the truth. A feeling is something that something is true may not correspond with what is true, and in fact, oftentimes does not correspond with what is true. Bias, propaganda, point of view. Biased people may not be aware of their biases, but propagandists know of their interests and they hide them from others. People with a point of view, however, are willing to clarify their views when asked to do so, and state their views clearly enough that they can be examined critically. And the difference between beliefs and facts, opinions, and reasoned judgments as well. Some beliefs can be tested, but others can't. But there's a commitment to a certain concept, a certain view, let's say, of the world, and a reluctance to criticize that view. Generally, a belief implies this is a part of me and I really don't want to look at this. Not necessarily the case always, but sometimes. Whereas facts can be defined as beliefs that have been critically examined and tested, but also it can be falsified. Opinions are statements of preference or values and an opinion is neither true nor false, and a lot of times somebody expresses, I see this on social media a lot, somebody expresses an opinion and people jump all over it. That's not true. This is just an opinion, and nobody said it is true. It's what I believe, and that's a different thing, which is also a belief, I guess. Whereas reasoned judgments are sound arguments that are based on good evidence. And so just some things to keep in mind, again, some distinctions to keep in mind as we deal with this issue. So Gambrill closes with, or she doesn't close, but she says, the better your learning and critical thinking skills are, the more likely you'll discover what's missing. So, among the things that you should do as a critical thinker, cultivate helpful beliefs about learning. Knowing and understanding are products of our own efforts and our own intellectual processes. Teachers only facilitate. So, what that says to you is in this course with mega chapters to read, for instance, that really it's really up to you to do this reading, and as hard as it is. I mean, if you want to gain all of this knowledge, and I don't mean to, well, just leave that there. Teachers are only facilitators, and there are certain things that I can do to help facilitate that process as well. But in the end, what you learn in this course, whether you read and listen to the lectures and make it to all the collaborate sessions or whatever, that's really your thing, and all I do is kind of make those things available to you, and try to help you negotiate all that stuff. Critically assess your values, skills, and knowledge, and be willing to challenge what you believe. Be open to new possibilities. Cultivate your learning skills. Question the kinds of things you read. Look for alternative explanations. Look for specific questions. Try to be as specific as possible when things are general. Ask questions. Take advantage of learning opportunities when they present themselves. Be a skeptic. Don't allow yourself to be overly impressed with material that's, especially material that's difficult to understand, but any material really. Don't be overly impressed. Sometimes when I read some of the studies, let's say for instance, it gets into language sometimes that just loses me, and I sometimes I have to look up the words, and everything, and in the end, one of the things that I found myself doing over the years is kind of just go back to the summary and read what the finding was, and skipping over all the stuff in the middle. I think a lot of people do that. Just because all that stuff's in there, all that jargon's there, all that technical stuff is there, doesn't mean that this is true. So don't allow yourself to be overwhelmed with things that are too difficult to digest. Look beyond labels. Use supervision as fully as possible. Having been a supervisor for the last probably half of my career, really, this is something that's kind of near and dear to me, because I think the people that I was most able to help were the ones who could come to me and be honest with me about things, and sit down and discuss conflicts they had, question and challenge, but being truthful. Sometimes people feel that they have to hide the truth from their superiors, and that really is not only unethical, but it's also, it just is very unproductive. And uh, I once had I once was told by one of my employees that one of the employees' coworkers said that just tell Bill that you did what you were supposed to do, and you're good. He'll believe you. And it was really kind of an eye opener for me hearing that, and because when I hired people, I tried to hire people who were professional that I was sure I could trust based upon what I saw. And you learn sometimes that's not the case. But as an employee, that's a resource for you, and I just encourage you to develop a positive relationship with your supervisor. You'll know soon enough when you have good supervision that it's a safe thing to do. Some points to ponder here as we close this discussion. There's just some quotes I pulled out of this chapter that I really like. Gambrill says, "If you're not making mistakes, you're probably not learning." Proctor and Schevinger, who I've never heard of, but I like what they had to say here, that the study of ignorance is just as important as the study of knowledge. Karl Popper, who she quotes throughout the textbook, as a philosopher from the late 1900s, who frankly I had not heard of before I read this text. But Popper says that there's only one way of learning to understand a problem which we do not yet understand, and that is to try and solve it and fail. And finally, Socrates tells us, "I know that I know almost nothing, and hardly this. So if you have any worries about knowledge and what you do know and don't know, maybe some of these quotes well will give you a little bit of steam as you press forward in your evidence-based practice and in critical thinking. So that's it for these two chapters. There's more lectures to come, but hope that you find something of value in this.